Thank you, Emmanuel. So before I'll start my presentation, I have a quiz question for you. I would like to know from you which nation has been ranked #1 for innovation worldwide for the last 3-4 years. You don't count, please. So, sorry, what did I hear? United States. Okay, I'd like to hear another answer.
Switzerland?
Yes, please, absolutely. So that kind of explains why when a Swiss employers organization contacted us and asked us, we would like to understand the digital revolution a little bit better. We want to understand what disruption in digital means for our members. We absolutely said, yes, we would like to work together with you because, of course, not only are we interested in how digital disruption affects enterprises, but more importantly, specifically related to how do these companies use social media as an innovation tool. So if we look at the slide, not really surprising, next one, Pierre-Jean, we discovered Pierre-Jean and Emmanuel already talked about open innovation, innovation that is generated from outside of your company. We are, of course, moving very much away from the internal R&D centric, not invented here company and innovation model to models where the innovation is created externally, as we saw in the previous case study. So what did we discover? Well, we looked at our Swiss, what we detected in the survey, a lot of surprising findings. Actually, yes, we sliced and diced data in different ways, but generally we saw that innovation is just as much generated internally as externally, which we thought was extremely interesting for these SMEs. It's the SME population that we specifically looked at and discovered that with. And then we actually looked at those sources of external innovation, open innovation. And surprisingly enough, we actually discovered that, you know, the classics we knew about and we expected, like outside innovation comes from our customers. Well, you know, not a surprise. It comes from our third-party partners, suppliers, etc. But then ranking #4 was actually social media platforms. And we thought that was very exciting, a little bit similar to the findings from our main survey, that actually innovation is triggered by social media. It is a big enabler, and it is a key topic. So then, of course, we wondered, why aren't universities a little bit more present, institutions? And what we found is there is an answer for that. In some instances, when you look at regional innovation, SMEs don't necessarily get as much access to university or research institutions just because they also choose not to. They don't necessarily also have the bandwidth to interface with these organizations, whereas social media is actually very accessible. You can tap into the wisdom of crowds of social media according to your internal resources. So that's basically what we found. So we wanted to drill into that in a little bit more detail. We had the confirmation, yes, you know, Swiss SMEs who were judged to be extremely innovative do see social media as a clear and important source of innovation. So then, and then I don't necessarily have to talk about, you know, when we looked at the academic literature, why this was the case and how it was confirmed. If we maybe look at the next slide, we drilled into a little bit more detail. And what we saw is, yes, you know, the next generation SME needs to leverage digital. They need to be orchestrating their innovation ecosystem. And as part of that, social media and digital tools are very much a keystone for that, a cornerstone for creating that. But more importantly, when we looked at the SMEs that were extremely successful in leveraging social media for innovation, what do you think we found? Well, we can summarize it in a little bit academic, pretentious-sounding formula, which is the integration rate of social media within the structure of the company. What does that mean? So I'll just translate it into simple formula. Basically, the recipe for success for these SMEs for integrating social media for innovation purposes was to have a digital strategy, which was aligned with its social media strategy, and then coincidentally, of course, data processing resources. And that is the magic formula. If you really want to leverage social media for innovation purposes and you are an SME and you see that it is a very cost-effective way for creating innovation, because you don't have the bandwidth to have these big R&D labs, you don't have the bandwidth to necessarily buy IP from other companies, then this is very successful. So one thing I'd also like to illustrate is we saw two extreme ranges of companies also. On the one hand, as I said, the digital savvy companies with the strategies that are aligned. What we did also see is that actually the SMEs that were most enthusiastic about digital disruption, in a lot of instances, they were the least informed about digital resources per se. So they didn't see the risks, highly enthusiastic, saw the opportunities, but didn't necessarily have a digital strategy, social media strategy, and didn't have the data resources. So the quote on the top kind of illustrates that extreme range of the SMEs we saw. We see digital as a great opportunity, but guess what? We haven't managed to hire the data specialist we want. On the other hand, we saw the companies that were extremely successful in leveraging that. And so what I also want to illustrate, I'd like to also show another result of our qualitative interviews, which is, and so this looks a little bit confusing, so I have to explain a little bit. On this side, we have the usage of knowledge search on social media and network ties on social media of the knowledge workers. So are these knowledge workers using social media a lot for creating knowledge? That is their profile. And then how do they say that their company actually uses social media in the innovation phases? And so what we were expecting to see is clusters. You would naturally assume that if you have people who are enthusiastic about social media, understand it, use it a lot, and know how to interpret it, then they would maybe thrive or be more present in companies that use it in most innovation phases. And actually, this just illustrates a finding that we have been seeing consistently. There's not necessarily a cluster or a pattern. And I think what that means is that actually there is a tendency to say, oh, let's just hire great people who are savvy in digital and data analysis, who use social media, and because of self-organizing networks, they will do great work. And I think one of the learning here is actually that's true for a lot of projects. However, for social media and innovation, that does not necessarily work. You want to have that digital strategy aligned with the social media strategy and data processing. Then, of course, I'd like to finalize by explaining some of the best practices we've seen with these SMEs. And so on the anecdotal side, for instance, what I can describe, and I think you've all witnessed that, if you have an SME, social media is not always an afterthought, but often you say, okay, we need to quickly hire someone who will work on social media because it's big, it's important for us. But often that resource is not really linked that closely to the product development team or to those people specifically in charge of innovation. So what we saw worked really well in these SMEs is actually someone working on social media paired with a senior representative who has responsibility over innovation. Also, what we saw is a lot of the SMEs, when they started developing like startups, being digitally innate, that helped. And then, of course, as I said earlier, you're an SME, you have to team up with organizations or inner information or innovation sources that are according to your bandwidth. If you partner with an organization that eats up all your resources and bandwidth, you will lose out long term. So as Emmanuel said earlier, public social media at the moment for SMEs, just because they don't have the resources of a multinational, is their best bet, and they see it as a really cost-effective way to get innovation. However, long-term, there is potential for regional hubs like, innovation platforms specifically dedicated for SMEs in a region. However, so far, what we have seen, these have been more failures than success, because one pattern also observed is if you have an innovation platform that has been only set up for innovation purposes, that is not centered around a company, but just around a region, there is a big chance of failure. So if I move then to the next slide, another thing we noticed is part of our main survey, we discovered something which also seemed quite counterintuitive. We started working on, if I go to next, on social media and innovation, thinking that one population that would be extremely innovative and enthusiastic about the innovation potential of social media, that would be, of course, the digital natives. We all know Premsky, and who has defined or coined the term digital native, Redmond, who kind of explains that each generation has its communication tools, and of course, generation Y and Z are the social media generation. So we started looking at our data, and we didn't really see that exciting patterns relating to age and social media use, which was our initial hypothesis. But what we did is we actually then started grouping together innovation profiles within different types of companies and organizations. And there we started to find a pattern which we weren't looking for, which kind of surprised us. We saw an overrepresentation of women in the category of social media enthusiasts. So, for instance, the perceived value of social media and the usage of social media, we saw that women seemed overrepresented in that category. We didn't necessarily knew, what does that mean? We kind of looked then at all the data we had, and every time we said, social media, social networks allow you to create ideas, etc. Consistently, we would see higher figures for women, and one of the explanations was initially more empirical. We would do qualitative interviews, and we saw that a lot of these women entrepreneurs were using social media as a very cheap way to get ideas for products, but also to commercialize them, to launch them. And we thought it was mostly linked to the fact that women create a lot of startups in the lifestyle category and segment, and so that's why social media is specifically important for them. But then we actually realized, looking at the academic literature and statistics, is we didn't discover anything basically new, because if you look at the technology acceptance model, Geffen and Straub, they're actually, when email, for instance, came out, again, same thing, women more enthusiastic about its perceived value and also usage. So actually, so we found something that already existed for other digital communication tools. And so if we then go to the next slide, we then thought, okay, why don't we look at this at a macro level? Why don't we go and see these social media companies and ask them, what do they make out of it? And so that was interesting, because they didn't tell us something we didn't know, because they said, you know what, you're right, it's a trend. So if I quote a senior vice president from Facebook, women are in general very active users of Facebook in markets of advanced economies, and this is a true topic for us. He said in French the word vrai sujet 6 times, but we don't really know what to do with it. That's interesting. We noticed it, but now what? And then we actually looked at Pew Research, and so it's interesting. Yes, men initially, when social media took off, were higher users, and then gradually women became stronger users. And so it's just a trend that we discovered, which actually is worldwide in most economies. And so what do we make out of it? Well, we think that partial conclusion is that when you talk about the digital gender divide, because that is a big topic in a lot of the conferences, both for policy makers but also for management, well, it depends what type of digital divide, because for social media and in certain economies that doesn't exist, and so it's a social construct. So then the question is, what do we do with this? Can we use this to do something positive? And one of the answers is, well, there is a leaky pipeline for women in STEM, in engineering, mathematics, sciences, technology. And so maybe social media can specifically be used maybe to address that issue, or also have more women work within these social media sites. So with that in mind, I will then talk about a next insight. Again, something that we actually realized more towards the end of our surveys. As Emmanuel highlighted, we have a mixed method approach, which is basically we alternate between quantitative and qualitative surveys. As soon as we see something we find interesting, a pattern, we try to drill in and have interviews about it. And something we discovered in a lot of the qualitative interviews is what we would call the digital work identity. So just to define, and if we go to the next slide, Emmanuel, what is a digital work identity? So please, I know that this word is being used a lot by the European Union Commission, by the ITU. We're not talking about the digital identity, which is your digital footprint, your ID, etc. What we are talking about is your work identity, as defined by Herminia Ibarra. Everything you do as part of your professional life that becomes your professional identity, that is work identity. And as we have seen, if we're saying that social media is an innovation tool, which we have seen consistently throughout all our studies, well then as a knowledge worker, actually your social media profile does become part of both your private and your professional work identity. And so let me give you some precise examples. So Emmanuel earlier related to how we categorize different types of social media platforms. So in a normal world, just let me give you three really precise examples of 3 different type of knowledge workers that work for 3 different type of companies. So let's take Mark. Mark is a product manager for a startup in e-commerce. And so what actually happened is he wanted to have a digital private identity very separate from his professional identity. So what he said is, everything that's Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, etc. is private for me. And then, of course, all these other networks like these company licensed internal enterprise networks are just business for me. Same thing with these platforms, business, business, business. But then what happened? Well, Mark deals a lot with developers, and actually, when he has something really urgent to ask these developers, he actually also has their Snapchat and their Instagram profile, and that's the best way he can reach them. So actually, he's mixing up, although Instagram and Snapchat was supposed to be private, he's actually mixing it with his professional contacts. And then it just so happens that Slack is the internal social media that his CEO has chosen for their startup. And because he works for this very cool startup, he actually sees his colleagues not only for drinks after work, but he also sees them on the weekend, and then he actually combines and contacts them through Slack on weekends for also leisure purposes. And in addition to that, Mark has his job at this e-commerce startup, but he also has his own personal project which is developing music, and he's also looked at some algorithms. And so actually, even for his private hobby, he looks at these 2 social media platforms. So he actually mixes up his 2 digital identities. And as I said, digital identity is everything from your professional and personal email that seems to merge to your public media presence. Just to confirm that, we have then also integrated that question in a survey, and as you see, most people strongly agree that yes, these 2 identities have merged. 2 other examples now, let's look at SMEs. We have Pierre, who works for a pharmaceutical SME. Again, he wanted to create his 2 digital identities to be extremely differentiated, but what happened is actually because he works for an SME and he's in charge of partnerships, he actually had to use his personal address book, Facebook, to get in contact with partners that he needs for his company. Because the bandwidth and the address book of his SME is a little bit limited, he had to leverage and go into his personal contacts. And again, similar to the previous example, he does mix up these different platforms. And now, of course, you're going to say, okay, but what if you work for a big multinational company? These big multinational companies, they have people only working on social media. On top of it, they're a little bit more traditional. So employees from that type of company should not have to merge their digital identities and combine private with professional. And now let me give you an example of Nick. He's in charge, again, a profile of someone who's working on the mobile ecosystem. So all of the examples I gave you were people who work in functions that are more or less obviously related to innovation. So Nick is looking after the mobile ecosystem of Cisco, and he wants to keep Facebook extremely private. You know, what he does on the weekend with his friends traveling, etc., should not be seen by the people in the office. And guess what happens? Cisco asks him, he gets bonus points if he mentions the launch of a new product from Cisco on his personal social media. Now, on the anecdotal side, do you know what he gets in exchange for his bonus points? He doesn't know either. So he gets bonus points, but then when I asked him, what do you does it give you a promotion? Do you get, better incentive plan at the end of the year? He said no. But of course, as an employee, you want to be seen as the good pupil, so of course you're going to do it, right? So this leads us, what does this mean? So as a manager, when you're managing teams, I think this raises an issue that we are all very well aware about. It's the work-life balance. It's also how do you manage your employees. There are a lot of legal issues that, of course, are still to be discovered but also dealt with. And then more importantly, if you look at what does this mean for policymakers, all of these different insights, if I go to the next slide, so first of all, as Emmanuel and Pierre-Jean said, and as we've all confirmed, if social media is an innovation tool, well, of course companies need to start to train on it. They have to put, interesting content on their internal social media sites. But it's also an issue for education generally, because what we did notice is when we looked at a lot of the millennials, they don't necessarily see the difference between sponsored information, real news, real fake news, fake news, all of these different types of information. So clearly, if you're a policymaker, you want to make sure that the generation you're educating can, first of all, understand what is true and false information, and then how do I get the most relevant information for my job, because this is a digital work skill. How do I get it from social media? And yeah, veracity, like how true is this information, is real important. Then, of course, let's talk a little bit about innovation ecosystems and networks, because that is a big topic, and a lot of people think, how do we get this right? And as I mentioned earlier, just saying we're going to create an innovation network does not work. You have to feed it, you have to be relevant, and if it is relevant, it is a blockbuster, as we have seen in the previous case study. And then, of course, I think there's a huge opportunity to look at how this information from social media can be put into digestible formats for SMEs, because I find a lot of the policies are very multinational centric or region centric, and there's not a lot of focus on SME. I think there's a perception issue where people, when they think about open innovation, think about Procter & Gamble or big multinationals. I think this is huge and very important for SMEs. Concluding on women, STEM and social media, again, I think this is an opportunity. If women are more enthusiastic about these collaborative digital tools, well, how can this be leveraged for repairing the leaky STEM pipeline, for instance? And then more importantly, this is my favorite topic. So, all of these big social media platforms that are very successful, which are the public ones, which are mainstream, operate in the principle of first mover advantage. They are extremely, extremely powerful. And although I have seen amazing work been done by academics and scholars, but also practitioners on information that is publicly available on social media sites like Facebook, like LinkedIn, you can do amazing research. However, I do believe that if you are what Ruth and Pepper call an embedded researcher, that means you have a privileged relationship with Facebook and LinkedIn. You actually get to see a little bit more about the secret sauce, the algorithms, all of the things that we're discussing in the news. And so, yes, it's a big competitive advantage. So I'd like to finalize my presentation with a little quiz. So first of all, LinkedIn has done what they call the Graph Challenge. So they have said, we want to work with researchers. We let researchers bid for projects with us, and we will then decide and award them. And once they are part of our little community, we will give them access to our data. So first of all, I have two questions for you. How many researchers and universities do you think they chose? Number one question. Number two, what do you think about what they, so this started in 2014, and now just in 2017, they came up with one of their findings. This is what you see here, and I've put in quotation marks. This is one of their findings. What do you think about their findings? And of course, I will personally already tell you, I think the word sponsorship bias comes to my mind, because what they are saying, and if you don't want to read this, is basically they looked at the difference between male and female graduates from MBA programs, and the women had as many skills, but they didn't do as many job descriptions and summaries. So why do you think I have a problem with this? Because LinkedIn, their job is to have as much detailed job descriptions as possible. Have you ever noticed when you go to your LinkedIn profile, they will say, your LinkedIn profile is 70% complete. You know, their goal in life is to have as much information. I'm not saying that this is a bad research topic or that's a bad finding. I just say that given their goal in life, this looks a little bit like bias. You know, the research is tending in a direction which coincidentally is what LinkedIn is most interested in. So I don't want to discuss this for hours. What I'm saying is, I think we have, as practitioners who also see the academic side and do research and management, there's a unique opportunity to tell these platform leaders, you have unbelievable access to information as it has never existed before in mankind. You can gather it. I mean, I find LinkedIn as a database extremely amazing. Please work with us. And now I will let you answer my question. How many universities do you think they selected, or how many research? Can you give me a number, please? Sorry? Very good. Another one? Yeah, 11. I mean, 11, with all the this amazing treasure chest of knowledge, there could be more. So again, there's much more in the report that we mentioned earlier, but these are some of the counterintuitive findings where there's some applications for practitioners, some lessons learned, etc., that we thought might interest you most today. So with that, I will hand over to Pierre-Jean, who will just conclude and just say, where you can get this magnificent report.
So I invite every speaker to join me and say a big thank you for listening to us. And you have the link towards the report of the findings that we have presented to you. And if you have some questions, we are pleased to